I've never seen The Sopranos or, any show that's on cable I've never seen. Except for this one night where I'm just surfing through the channels and the show comes on called Man vs. Wild, which I'd never seen before or since. And I happened to look at the episode where the guy is in the Florida Everglades in this little hummock above the swamp, and he's trying to get a fire started, and everything's sopping wet, and he can't get it started, So I watched it for about 10 minutes, and I thought, this is stupid, and I shut it off. So the next day, I get to the trailhead where the walk is, and there's 25 people there waiting for me. They had all seen the show. And so they're peppering me with all these survival questions. Could you survive on this? And could you survive on that? And this one guy asked me, is an acorn a complete protein? And I said, what kind of a strange question is that? Who would tell you that you could only eat acorns? I since found out an acorn is a complete protein, but actually I didn't know at the time. So after a while, I got a little miffed at all these people asking me these survival questions. And I said, all right, people, look, granted, we are in Wolfboro, New Hampshire. It is a little boony up here, but even here, you'd be able to hike out to the nearest 7-Eleven way before you'd find yourself in a starvation situation, so just relax, all right, relax. All right, so then we started the walk, and the walk was on one of these multi-use trails where in New Hampshire, in the summer, they're used by the runners and the mountain bikers, in the winter, they're used by the skiers and the snowmobilers and stuff. And the snowmobilers like to make these little hand-lettered signs saying so many miles to this town, so many miles to that town, so what. So we start the walk, and we're walking along, and 10 minutes after I make that wisecrack, swear to God, this is the sign we saw. So my point was totally proven. Thank you. So, hi everybody. So, as I said, I'm from Arlington, and I grew up in Weston, so I did spend some time away from Massachusetts, but I really love New England, and I love the landscape of New England. I particularly love to connect to it via my taste buds. So I'm retired now, but when I worked for the state Fish and Game Department, I worked on rivers. And so here, as you may know, we're in the headwaters of the Shawshene watershed, and there's a little bit of the Aberjona, which connects to the Mystic and stuff like that. So these are rivers that I'd work on. A lot of the rivers I'd work on were in central western Mass, and so I'd have to go out there for work, and after my official work was done, I'd be out there with my foraging basket just collecting whatever happened to be in season, because for me, foraging is a great way to enrich all the time I spend outdoors. So whether it's a vacant lot across the street at the edge of the school ball field or the bike path, foraging doesn't have to be in the wilderness somewhere. It can be like as close as your own backyard. And I pretty much guarantee you're going to see at least one plant tonight that you have in your own backyard that perhaps you didn't know was edible. So, all right, so before we get into the show, I just want to cover a couple ground rules about foraging, just to encourage you to do it in a conservation-minded way, because that's particularly important where native species are involved, because native species often have important roles in the ecosystem. Animals rely upon them for food or some other important portion of their life cycle. So it's good to show a lot of forbearance and restraint where you're gathering native species, just to make sure you don't upset the ecological balance in any way. So, but depending upon the part of the plant you're harvesting, there are going to be different impacts. For example, berry picking, nut gathering, and actually mushroom hunting. I'll get to mushrooms in a second. Those are relatively benign foraging activities, because all you're doing is picking the seed or the spore dispersal portion of the organism. So there's often a lot of those around. If you gather some, it's not that much of an impact. But if you are digging up plants to harvest them, or stripping all the leaves or all the flowers off plants to harvest them, you can imagine it could be a lot more traumatic for the plant. Okay? All right, so then there's two other conservation issues, and one is could you pick something on the state rare and endangered species list? You want to do that. And then what is the impact on animals by you going out and picking stuff before they get to it? So I have looked at the Mass Rare and Endangered Species list, and there are some edible species on that list, but they tend to be uncommon cousins of common edible wild plants. And the uncommon cousins are restricted to pristine or unusual habitats. And there aren't a lot of those in this area of the state. But if you're in a place where you're going to run into bogs or fens or cliffs or mountaintops or the coastline, our Massachusetts coastline, as extensive as it is, that's considered an unusual habitat in Massachusetts. So if you are in a pristine or unusual habitat and you see a plant that looks somewhat like but not exactly like a plant that you see in the show or that you read about in a book, my advice would be don't pick it, just to make sure you're not going to pick the rare cousin by mistake. In actuality, though, it's much more likely that a plant you want to pick and eat is on another state list, and that's the invasive species list. So these are the non-native plants that have pushed into our natural habitats, and the main bad thing they do is they usurp the habitat for our native species. They just take it away from them. So ecologically, these plants are very bad news. So I keep meaning to make a slide of the cover of this book so I could just throw it up on the screen, but I'll just show. This is a guidebook that the state helped put out half a dozen years ago to educate people about invasive species, and the book covers 66 of what are considered to be the most ecologically disruptive species in the state. So those species ecologically, they're bad news, but if there's a silver lining to the cloud, at least for some of them, it might be the fact that some of them are edible. In fact, out of the 66 species in this book, at least 20 of them are edible. And as far as at least most ecologists are concerned, they'd be thrilled if we all picked and ate as many of those as we possibly could. I'm totally serious about that. It's guilt-free foraging. You can't pick too much of them, provided that you're not spreading them around in the process, but that is easily avoidable. So I want to give you a chance to nibble on an invasive species right away. So there it is. It's called autumn olive. Some people call it Russian olive, but if the fruit is red like this, it's actually called autumn olive. It's from Eastern Asia, so it's not native, and it loves to grow in really poor soil like gravel pits and highway medians. And the main reason it's a ton of it in Massachusetts is because the Mass Highway Department planted thousands of the plants before they knew it was invasive. Now they regret it. So what I do is I puree the fruit and dehydrate it, and I make fruit leather from it, which are what's in these containers. So take a piece. And I'll talk a little bit more about how I make it later. And before I forget, let me just mention a spot that used to be a really good place to pick autumn olive. I'm afraid it's a little overgrown now, but it's very close to here. It's behind the Marriott Hotel, right on Mall Road. So you go to the back parking lots behind the building, and right there on the edge of the service road that feeds the back is an autumn olive bush. And actually, if you clamber down the hill into the vacant area that's behind there used to be like a grove of autumn olive bushes. And I used to go and pick there, but now it's so overgrown, it's really, you need a machete to get through there. So anyway, but I'll just mention that as a very close by opportunity where you can at least see the plants, get familiar with them, and then you could go find it in a place where it's easier to collect. All right, so while you're nibbling on that, let me cover the third conservation issue, which is what is the impact on animals by you going out and picking whatever it is and eating it before they get to it? Well, first of all, if you're being good conservationists and you're leaving plenty of the native species behind after you're harvesting for them, then you're leaving plenty behind for the animals too. But so that's good. But then on the other hand, so sometimes people say, well, if an animal can eat it, I can eat it, right? Like, so I was leading a walk a number of years ago, and someone on the walk said to me, Russ, I was in my yard the other day, and I saw a mushroom with an animal bite taken out of it. Does that mean I can eat it? And the answer is no, at least not necessarily, because there isn't 100% overlap between what people can eat, what animals can eat, because our taste buds and our digestive systems are different. Okay, so for example, poison ivy. A lot of deer eat poison ivy leaves, birds eat the poison ivy berries. We're not going to fight them over the poison ivy. They can have all the poison ivy they want. In fact, we wish they'd eat more poison ivy. All right? So there's that issue. You know, just because an animal eats it doesn't mean we can eat it. And number two, you don't know what happened to that animal after it ate that mushroom. It might have died a horrible death. So animals can make mistakes too, so you can't count on them. All right? Okay, so I'm going to plunge into the show now. And so when I start getting into mushrooms in the show, I'll tell you a little bit more about them. But we're going to do about plants now. By the way, these slides are organized chronologically by harvesting time. So the show starts about a month from now and then goes through the season into the fall. All right, so let's get past there. There's the intro slide. Anybody know what this plant is? No. All right, very good. Somebody got it. Yeah, this is stinging nettle, a plant that you could recognize in the dark, a plant that you could recognize even if you were blind by getting stung from it. And if you haven't been stung by stinging nettle, it's not like poison ivy where you find out a day or two later that you got into it. If you're stung by stinging nettle, you know right away. But on the good side, the sting rarely lasts more than an hour or two. And I'm going to show you an antidote in just a second. All right, but this is a wonderfully edible plant, and this is the right stage to get it. So what I'm doing is just, and by the way, I know how to do this with my bare hands. But if you're a novice, I would suggest wearing gloves just to not get stung. But anyway, so I'll just break off the top cluster of each little nettle plant like that, and just take that part. That's the tender part. And I'll just basically prune the little nettle plants. And this slide I took the second week of April. So that's when I'm usually looking for this plant. Yes?
About, what, 6 inches tall?
That's right, yeah. Yep. And then I'll bring the nettle tops home. I'll throw them in a pot or a bucket just to wash them off. And then I'll take some tongs. I'm still not touching them. I'll take some tongs and just fling them into the cooking pot and then steam them with basically the water that's still clinging to the leaves in the washing process. And so you steam them for like 5-6 minutes, and they shrink quite a bit, but that steaming process completely disarms the plant, makes the sting go away completely, and actually it converts the chemical that causes sting into a protein. So the plants are about 7% protein. They've got all kinds of other vitamins and minerals like calcium in them. Stinging nettle greens are among the highest, most nutritious things you could eat. It's kind of like a vitamin pill of the plant world. So after you've steamed them like this, you could eat them just plain if you want, or you could do stuff with them. So here's a cream of stinging nettle soup, and this recipe is from my book. Yeah, it sounds like something that might have been on the old Addams Family TV show. But anyway, it's very easy to make. And then there's these stinging nettle balls, and this is it's kind of a retro recipe. This is the spinach balls recipe from the 1950s, where you hold everything together with Pepperidge Farm stuffing mix. And you just substitute the steamed nettle greens for the spinach, and it works great. All right, anybody know what this plant is? It's catnip, and catnip does occasionally go wild, and catnip has the opposite effect on people that it has on cats. It's a sedative, it's a tranquilizer, so people will drink catnip tea to relax after a stressful day, and you could use the leaves fresh or dried either way. Okay, so here's the antidote to the stinging nettle. There's a plant called curled or curly dock, and it looks like this in the spring or in the late summer, early fall. And it's also edible. These leaves have a bit of bitterness to them, so I'll drop them into boiling water just for about 20 seconds just to blanch them and get rid of the bitterness, and then you can use them just like cooked spinach. So these leaves, as well as the steamed stinging nettle, they're really good in spanakopita, the Greek spinach pie with the phyllo dough and the feta cheese. So just substitute that for the spinach. It works great. All right, and so now we're going to talk about a couple invasive species. So this one is at or near the top of the ecological blacklist. It is despised by ecologists. It's a plant called Japanese knotweed. And it doesn't look like this now. What it looks like now is you're driving along a roadside or riverside, and you'll see all this bamboo-like stuff that's about 10 feet tall. It have kind of a reddish-brown color to it, and it's in a big, patch like 25 feet diameter, something like that. That's the Japanese knotweed. And seeing that is very useful to you, because that's telling you where to go to look for the edible part. And this is the first edible part that's going to show up around the middle of April. It's the young shoots of the plant. And you could just break them off at ground level and steam them for a few minutes and eat them hot or cold like asparagus. But my favorite stage to get this plant is what I call the wild rhubarb stage. So I let the stalks get a little bit taller, about 2 feet tall, and then I'll cut them at ground level and lop off the top cluster leaves, and then I'll have a length of stalk about that long. And the very outer layer of a knotweed stalk is stringy. There's nothing poisonous about it, but I recommend that you peel the very outer layer off just to get that stringy bit off so it doesn't get caught in your teeth later. And then, but the knotweed stalks are hollow, so you don't want to peel too deeply, or all you have left is the hole. You just want to get that very outer layer off. And then you end up with this crisp green tube, which is tart and juicy. You can eat it right in the spot. It tastes kind of like a Granny Smith apple. Or you could chop it up like I have here and then use it instead of rhubarb in virtually any recipe calling for rhubarb. It's related to rhubarb, so it's not surprising it tastes like rhubarb. So here is my strawberry knotweed pie. This recipe's in my book. And virtually everybody I serve this pie to prefer it over strawberry rhubarb pie. It's that good. So, all right, so you might be saying, all right, it's good, but I'm intimidated by pie crust, and that's a lattice work top. I don't know if I can pull that off. So I'm going to show you a way to use the knotweed that requires no cooking skill whatsoever. is you just take those little hollow stems and fill them with like a flavored cream cheese or a salmon mousse or whatever, and you have a little tart, little edible container, and you don't have to cook it or anything. All right, so here's another invasive species, garlic mustard, that ecologists also hate. I don't get quite as excited about eating this one as the knotweed, because this one is rather bitter and pungent. There's one stage to the plant where it's a little nicer, and that's the, the developing stalk on the second year plants. This is a biennial plant. This is what it does the second year. So this tender stalk right there is the mildest part of the plant, and you can eat it raw. You could chop it up and use it in stir fries. All right, here's a plant called wintercress, and this is related to broccoli rabe. This is a wild counterpart of broccoli rabe, so you can use this the exact same way. So the whole plant's edible, but mainly I'm eating this part, which is like a little wild broccoli floret right here. It's very common farm and garden weed. Anybody know what this plant is? It is not phlox. It's a very common mistake. All phlox family flowers have 5 petals. These have 4 petals. This is actually a plant called Dame's Rocket. It's an invasive species, so it's another guilt-free foraging opportunity. It does grow in eastern Mass. You'll see even more of it like as you go in western Mass to Berkshire County and into New York State. You're going to run into a ton of it. And you see how it comes in a white and a purpley color? That's almost always how you see it in the wild, the 2 colors together. It's just 2 forms of the same species. So now the main edible part on this plant are the flowers. You can eat them raw, straight into your mouth. You don't have to do anything with them. And they have a sweet, garlicky, radishy flavor. They're quite nice. Now, although the white flowers and the purpley flowers have the same flavor, I tend to just use the purple color because purple's a funner color than white. But you could use the white color too. And just put them into a salad or decorate anything else that you're serving. It's great. Okay, so with that snow-capped mountain in the background, you can tell I didn't take this photo in Burlington. I took it actually at the northern end of North Conway after you drive past all the outlet stores and the El Bean and everything, and you merge from all that, and you look across this field, you see the presidential range in Mount Washington in the background. But the purpose of the photo is to talk to you about dandelions. Dandelions are probably responsible for turning more people off of eating wild plants than anything else, and the story usually goes something like this. So it's the spring, you look in your backyard, you see all the dandelion plants blooming, and you say, oh, dandelion plants, I've heard they're edible, I should try them. And so you go outside, you pick a few leaves, you bring them indoors, you put a little oil and vinegar on them, you take a bite, it's incredibly bitter, and you want to fix that while I'm talking? All right. I hate when that happens. Anyway, it's good. So, all right, it's incredibly bitter, and you spit out the dandelion. You say, yuck, I'm never going to eat a wild plant again, which is a real shame because dandelions are great if you eat the right part at the right time. So what is that, and when is that? Well, when you start seeing whole fields turning yellow with dandelion flowers, I really think it's too late to be eating dandelions at that point. So my favorite time to get them is before the flowers come out, and it's actually the unopened flower buds, which I consider the best part of the plant. In fact, they're one of my most favorite vegetables, period, cultivated or wild. They're like a cross between spinach, corn, Brussels sprouts, and artichokes. So they're really yummy. Now and especially when they're tucked into the base of the plant, they're quite mild. So now each one of these is only about 1/4 inch long, and so I could hear you saying, well, Russ says they're tasty, delicious, but how am I going to feed my family with this teeny little dandelion bud? And I want to assure you that if you go to like the edge of an organic farm or a place where the plants get nice and big, I found plants that have over 200 dandelion buds per plant. Yes, it takes a little while to pick them up. This is around the end of April, beginning of May, by the way, when I'm looking for plants at this stage. So, so you're finding plants like that. It doesn't take long at all before you can gather all you need. And then what I'll do is just bring them home, and you want to wash them, like just dump them into a bucket of water and swirl it around just to get off the sand or the grit of the soil, whatever that might be mixed there. Then get a pot of water boiling on the stove, throw the dandelion buds in, cook it for 60 seconds. That's all they need, and then they're done. And you can use those buds in omelets or casseroles or soups, whatever. But before you do anything with them, before you even put any salt or butter on them, just try them plain, and I think you'd be amazed at how good they are. And by the way, if you want to eat dandelion leaves, that's the time to pick them before the flowers start blooming. And so when I'm picking the tender buds off the plant, if I see some tender leaves on there, I just gather them and prepare them the same way. All right, so violets are edible. This is your standard what's called the dooryard violet, the thing that you would see in the lawn in your backyard if your lawn isn't chemically addicted, and I hope none of yours are. So the flowers are edible, the leaves are edible, and you can candy the flowers and use them to decorate other things, which is great. So this is a plant called chicory. This is related to dandelion. These flowers don't come out until the summer. It's a very common sight along the roadsides, but this plant has edible leaves in the spring and in the fall. In the summer they get too bitter, but the spring and fall is okay. The flowers are edible too. They have almost no flavor, so why use them? Because blue is an unusual food color, so it's fun to just snip the petals off just to get that color in a salad or whatever. And then the root, the chicory root, is used to make the well-known coffee substitute or additive. And this is explained in my book, but basically you dig up the roots, wash them off, roast them slowly in an oven till they're brittle and aromatic, and grind them up in a food processor, and then use whatever coffee maker you use to brew the beverage. And I find that the drink you make from the chicory tastes remarkably like coffee, especially if you usually drink your coffee with cream and sugar, and you make the chicory drink the same way. Flavor is really similar. There is one big difference, though. Chicory does not have caffeine in it. So if you're one of these people who says, well, what's the point of drinking it if there's no caffeine in it, then the chicory is just not going to cut it for you. Okay, so here's chickweed, and this is a very common spring or fall edible. Once again, in the summer it gets too stringy, it's not worth eating, but spring or fall is good. And I'll use this as a sprout substitute in a sandwich or a lettuce substitute in a salad. It has a nice, mild flavor. Okay, daisies are edible, and the yummiest part on a daisy are the leaves before the flowers come out, which you might not know how to recognize the plant then. But anyway, this part you can recognize. So this she loves me not flowers. So anyway, that's what the plant looks like before the flowers bloom, and this is the ideal stage to eat it. And I apologize that the photo's a little out of focus, but if you look at the flower buds here, they're flat on the top, and they have this marking that looks like the spokes in a bicycle wheel. So look for that, look for leaves like that, and then enjoy the daisy leaves. I've never tried to cook with them because they're so good raw. I just use them in salads, so they're excellent. Here's sheep sorrel. This is another plant that's good for salads. So this is the diminutive cousin of the French garden sorrel, so you can use it the same way. Here's a completely unrelated plant called wood sorrel that has the same flavor. It's just a botanical coincidence. And in this one, the flowers are edible, the leaves are edible. These things that look like little ears of corn, those are the immature seed pods, and they're tart and juicy and edible too. Now, the chemical responsible for the sour flavor in this plant and in the sheep sorrel I just showed you is a chemical called oxalic acid, which is not good to eat in huge amounts. Like if you ate a big salad bowl full of just that plant, it could inhibit your body's ability to absorb calcium, and it could irritate your stomach lining. But there's no reason to be unduly concerned about the chemical because it's present in a lot of conventional vegetables like beets and spinach and rhubarb. So as long as you're eating it in moderation, it's perfectly fine, okay? All right, so when I make a salad from wild ingredients, or when I make anything from wild ingredients, I'm not a purist about it. I don't insist that every single ingredient be wild. Like, so when I make that strawberry knotweed pie, I don't have to use yak butter for the shortening. I could use regular butter, regular sugar, that's fine. The knotweed makes it a wild dish. But you can make a salad completely from wild ingredients, which is what this one is, except for the croutons. So now you needn't go this extreme. You could just throw a few violet flowers in a regular salad, and that's fine. But you can make a perfectly palatable salad just from wild ingredients. Let me tell you what's in here. So the yellow flowers and mustard flowers, and the blue flowers are chicory flowers, and then there's chickweed and sorrel and lamb's quarters and some other green stuff bulking up the salad. And then the little red berries are partridge berries, and then these little sort of orangey tomato-like things, those are husk tomatoes or ground cherries. So that's what partridge berries look like. And partridge berries have virtually no flavor. So why use them? Because they're pretty. So I'll just put a few on top of a salad just to get that color in there. And then the ground cherries, this is actually a wild form of our tomatoes. And it is cultivated, so you see it sometimes in farmers markets, but it does grow wild here in Massachusetts too. The key thing to remember is you cannot see this fruit unless you pull the husk off of it that surrounds it. And so, for example, you see this tomato-looking thing here, you see the husk around there. So I had to pull that apart to see that fruit. So there it is down there. That's what it looks like when it's developing. So if you see something that looks like a tomato, a yellow tomato, cherry tomato that doesn't have a husk on it, it's not this edible plant. Yes, sir?
The same as Jerusalem cherry?
No. It is related, but it's not the same. All right. Okay, so here's a plant called evening primrose. This is a biennial, which means it has a 2-year life cycle. So the first year, it just produces a whorl of leaves like this and sends energy down to this big taproot. And then the plant witches over. And then the second year, it uses up the energy in that taproot to produce a flower stalk and flowers, and then the whole plant dies. That's a life cycle for an evening primrose. So the main edible part on an evening primrose is the root, and the best time to get it is between the first and second growing seasons. So that's what the flower looks like, and that's what the root looks like. And you notice there's some pink coloration near the top. It always has that. That's one of the identifying characteristics for it. And so far, my favorite way to use evening primrose is to grate up the root and make pancakes with it, like potato pancakes. So you can substitute an equivalent amount of evening primrose root for your potatoes, and whatever potato pancake recipe you use, it should come out great. Okay, so here's a plant that you often don't discover until you get home and you find these things caught in your socks or in your dog's fur. So it's a plant called burdock, and it's a wonderfully edible plant, not this part, but many other plants. And this one I've gathered in Burlington before. So this is also biennial. So this is what the plant looks like at the beginning of the second year. So the first year it looks like this too, and it sends energy down to this big beige taproot, and then the plant winters over, and then the second year it eventually gets to be about this tall and produces magenta colored flowers, and then those are followed by those round burrs, and then the whole plant dies at the end of the second year. That's the life cycle for burdock. So once again, if you want to eat the root, the best time to get it is between the first and second growing seasons. So there's a very long root that goes down below this plant, and unfortunately you can't grab the foliage and yank on it and get the root out that way because it will break on you. So you have to dig these roots up, and it is a lot of work, and I don't usually bother. And I pretty much guarantee that your patience will give out before the root does. That's how long it is. So you'll be digging and digging and digging, and at some point you say, the heck with it, and you just slice off what you have, and you might have dug up that amount of root, probably 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch thick. And so what you can do at that point, simple way to cook it is just wash it. You don't have to peel it. Slice it into 1/2 inch thick slices and boil it in salted water till it's tender, which is about 15 minutes. And it will taste like a starchy artichoke, which is fine. But as I said, I'm too lazy to do that. Instead, I go for the second year's growth. So this is when the plant is producing that cylindrical bloom stalk I was talking about. When it's about 1 foot tall, I cut it at ground level and lop off the top cluster leaves, and that's the part I'm harvesting. So this was about 20 minutes of collecting those in a spot where there are a lot of them. And you see this plant a lot on the edge of farm fields or other fields. And so you have to peel the very outer layer of a burdock stalk off because it's bitter and stringy, but unlike the knotweed stalks, these are solid all the way through. So after you're finished peeling, there's a lot of food left over. So talk about survival. If you did find yourself in a situation where you didn't have any access to food and you found burdock plants at this stage, you could completely relax because this could definitely fill you up. All right, so anyway, once you prepare those burdock stalks, you chop them in and you boil them in salted water till it's tender, about 5 minutes. It's a great vegetable, just plain or thrown in spaghetti sauce. It's really good. Or it's really good in the recipe I'm sure a lot of you have eaten, or perhaps you've even made it yourself, where ordinarily you take artichoke hearts and you mix them with mayonnaise and breadcrumbs and Parmesan cheese, and you bake it in the oven. It's a spread that you put on crackers, where you could substitute the boiled burdock flower stalk rounds for the artichoke hearts in that recipe, and it works great. And that recipe's on my webpage. So if you haven't found there it is. If you haven't found the handouts yet that are in the back, so pick those up at the end, and that recipe isn't in the handouts, but the links at the bottom of the handouts will take you to where the recipe is. All right. Okay, so here's a plant called catbrier, and this is a pretty common plant in the woods around here. And if you've done any bushwhacking, you're familiar with this plant. And this time of year, it's just a pain, literally and figuratively, if you want to get somewhere, because it's woody and thorny, and so how could it possibly be edible? Well, in the spring, at the ends of those woody vines, the new growth is nice and soft and supple, and even the thorns you can push in easily with your fingers, and you just take the whole thing and pop it right in your mouth. and it has kind of a tart flavor. So this is called Smilax rotundifolia, which means round-leaved in Latin. All right, but there's a cousin to this plant I like even more, and it's called carrion flower. This is Smilax herbaceous. So it's a herbaceous, non-woody, thornless form of the catbrier. So here it is on the left. So you see the dried stalks from last year's plant. There's one of the berries left from last year's growth, and here's this year's growth. It looks a lot like asparagus, doesn't it? It's actually related to asparagus. You harvest it just like asparagus. You prepared it just like asparagus. And there's my wife with Ellen with a whole bunch of it. And so, and that photo was taken less than 15 miles away from here. So it is in this area. So anyway, all right, so why is this plant called carrion flower? Okay, so here we are camping, and we're going to use this in an omelet. We're using a Frisbee as a plate here. So anyway, see these little spherical things here? Those are the flower buds. If we waited like a week longer to interact with this plant, we wouldn't want to be near it because it smells like dirty gym socks or rotting meat. So that's why it's called carrion flower. But if you harvest it before it blooms, it's very tasty. All right, so yes, sir.
Can you back up a minute and just describe the process that how you got to try all of this stuff? Because you said you started by reading books.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
Now, did you broaden that and start going out with experienced foragers?
No. No. Okay, so, all right.
Just run the risk of dying.
All right, so I discovered when I was a teenager that I could read a bunch of books and then be walking on the trail, and these plants would just sort of leap figuratively out at me saying, you know me, you know me. And I'd go and check, and sure enough, it was the thing I had read about. So I realized that most people don't have that skill. And so that's why I do these programs, and that's why most of the time I'm actually not doing slideshows, I'm doing walks. And I'm actually pointing to people to actual plants saying, here's what it is, here's what the plants, the habitat it likes, the plants it goes around, and that's the best way to learn. Yeah, so I would recommend that, learning that way. Okay, but I didn't just walk down the trail, pop stuff in my mouth and see what happens, because all that trial and error work has been done by Native Americans and many other people over millennia, so we can benefit from that accumulated knowledge. All right, sure. Okay, so mushrooms. All right, so before I talk about mushrooms, let me talk about plants, because this relates to what your question you just asked me. I'm happy to tell you that with a few exceptions, and it's important to note those, but the vast majority of poisonous plants that grow around here taste horrible. So my advice is don't eat plants that taste bad. It doesn't mean that every edible plant is going to be delicious straight from the bush or the vine or whatever. A lot of them require some kind of advanced preparation, but if you see a plant that you remember from this show, or you read about in a book, whatever, you think you got the right thing, you bring it home, you prepare it according to instructions, you got a big steaming plate of it in front of you, and you take a bite and it doesn't taste good, you might not want to override that danger signal your taste buds might be giving you. You might have made a mistaken identification, all right? Now, mushrooms, however, are a different story, because we have some poisonous mushrooms out there, and most of the poisonous mushrooms just make you, feel very sick for a few hours and then you get better. But we have at least a half a dozen that could potentially kill you, and unfortunately there's nothing in the flavor of those deadly mushrooms that gives you any indication there's anything to worry about. So you could have this delicious mushroom meal one day and be dead several days later from liver or kidney failure. All right, so that's the bad news. So the risk of picking and eating the wrong kind of mushroom and getting very sick or perhaps even dying is much, much greater than for plants. All right. Having said that, you can arrange all the mushroom species there are in a line, and clustered at one end are those species that are virtually impossible to confuse with anything poisonous, versus those at the other end that even the experts can't tell apart. And as long as you stay at the safe end of the line and you gradually work your way along as you gain experience and confidence, that's how you stay out of trouble. Everybody get that? All right. So the main mushroom hunting season in New England goes from the 4th of July until Columbus Day. That's when you're going to see the greatest quantity and variety of mushrooms. And we're still in the spring in the timing of this show now. So that's why the mushrooms haven't really showed up until now, and I'm just going to briefly cover one species now, and we'll talk more later as the show gets into the summer. But it's the morel, and the morel is a species that, let me put it this way, in eastern Mass, morels are maddeningly elusive. I have found them many times, but they're not easy. And I don't know if a couple of you, there was a story in NPR couple years ago where a reporter went around with the New York Mycological Club, and they went up into the apple orchards of the lower Hudson Valley to look for morels in the spring, which is a hint to you, one place to look for them is under old apple trees. And so the story is about them looking for morels and having kind of a hard time finding them. And the president of the club says, one thing I really look forward to is when morel season is over. Why would he say that? Because it's hard. They kicked your butt, okay? At least around here. So anyway, but this is one kind I have found just right, not in the middle of the wilderness somewhere, but like right in somebody's yard, right in the house, like right in my neighborhood, where these come up in the pea gravel by the foundation, they come up by the shrubbery in the front walk or in the mulch, stuff like that. This is the black morel. And so this photo, you can tell it was a long time ago because there's a film container. I mean, we're going to have to explain to our kids what that is because they won't know. So anyway, but all these morels were from one person's yard in Weston. So, and I would tell you where it is, but it would do you no good because they're gone now because this is kind of an ephemeral mushroom. It'll be there for like a year or two and then it'll eat up what it was eating and then it's gone and, you know, usually doesn't come back. So anyway, that's this one. The yellow morel, I'll get to in a second. That you can see in the same spot, but not so much the black morel. So, all right, so let's get to the yellow morel. So this photo on the left is from Pepperell, Mass, up near the Mass-New Hampshire border, where this woman, Sue Edwards, called me and said, I'm house-sitting this house, and I'm finding all these mushrooms. I don't know what they are. I said, I'll come over and check. So, and they were morels, so it was great. And then this photo is out from Western Mass. But anyway, around here, you want to look for, as I said, the older apple trees and recently dead elm trees where the bark is still attached to the tree and it hasn't sloughed off yet. And the weekend to do it is Mother's Day weekend. All right, so now I'm going to tell you a story about a walk I led in Stowe, Mass, and not that far away from here, on a Mother's Day weekend, and this is probably about 8 or 9 years ago. So there's a place called the Delaney property, and it's a place where a lot of people go walking their dogs. It's a flood control area. So the main path is on a berm, and then you look down to the sides, and that's where the growth is. And so we're walking along, and I'm talking to people about morels, and I said, yeah, you know, when I find morels, it's often this weekend, and we want to check under old apple trees or recently dead elm trees. And so we're walking along, and I look over to the left, and there, in fact, are a couple old apple trees and a recently dead elm tree right there. And so I said to somebody, would you just go down there and check and see if there are any morels? She goes down there and she says, yup. And I said, what do you mean, yup? She said, yeah, they're here. So we all tearing down there. There were a dozen morels exactly where they were supposed to be. That is very, very unusual to be that lucky. So anyway, but now you know, and good luck to you. I hope you find them. All right, so let's get back to plants. We'll do some more mushrooms later. All right, so this is the black locust tree. This is also an invasive species, so it's a guilt-free foraging opportunity. Pick all you want. And the edible part on this plant are the flowers. They come out around Memorial Day. And often if you're riding your bike or riding along in your car, you don't even have to have the windows down. A nice warm spring evening when these plants are blooming. There's so many in this area of the world, along 128 and stuff, that the entire air is perfumed with the fragrance of these plants. And you can smell it, just the vent, the air coming in your vent. And it smells like jasmine, which is what these flowers, and it tastes like sweet pea pods. So this is a really yummy thing. Just stuff your face right by the tree on these flowers, or you can pick them off the central stalks and then just mix them in a salad, just eat them plain. Or one really fun way to use them is to make fritters from them, and that recipe's in my book. All right, so this is pokeweed. Sometimes you'll hear it called poke salad, which is a word that's used in the South, and that's a little confusing because it's actually never eaten raw. You have to cook this one for 7 minutes to make it safe. And I apologize that this photo is a little out of focus, but that's what you want to look for. It's just, I have this one in the show because it's the dried stalk of last year's plant to help you identify the pokeweed shoot as opposed to something else, because the shoots always come up in the place where the last year's stalks are. Okay? So, all right. So there's the pokeweed, and then here's milkweed, which use the same cooking method for milkweed that use pokeweed. So milkweed's got it's a whole chapter on pokeweed and on milkweed in my book. It explains more with recipes and stuff. So milkweed buds are one of the parts you can eat on a milkweed. And then these have already been boiled for 7 minutes. and look how well they hold up. And this is the recipe in my book, The Milkweed Egg Puff, which is a great way to use them. And then the milkweed pods are edible when they're about an inch long and nice and firm to the touch, and the flavor is very similar to green beans. And the same thing, you boil them for 7 minutes. All right, but the monarch butterfly caterpillar is in the photo to remind us that this is indeed one of our native milkweeds that the butterflies rely upon to lay their eggs, and then the caterpillars eat the leaves and stuff. So, and you may have heard the stories about the decline in the monarch populations, and I've been assured by ecologists that the foragers are not responsible for that, but even so, I'll tell you what I do as a karmic payback to the milkweeds in a second. But anyway, from what I understand, the main reason why the monarchs are suffering is because as the butterflies are migrating north from Mexico, they run into this area in the lower Mississippi Valley where there's been this widespread adoption of these Roundup-ready crops, the corn and the soybeans, where they plant the crops that are resistant to the herbicide, and then they spray the herbicide, and the crops can survive, but it kills all the milkweed. So the butterflies have no place to lay their eggs. So they don't make it up here. All right, so anyway, so what I will do as a karmic payback to the monarchs, just to make sure I'm not having any impact on them, is I will, in the fall, when the ripe pods split open and the seeds are showing with little parachutes attached, if I see a nice healthy population of milkweeds, I'll gather some of those seeds. And as I'm driving along, if I see a nice habitat that ought to have milkweeds but doesn't, I'll just release the parachutes and help start a new colony. Okay, so here's sassafras. This is a native species that is very common along the eastern seaboard, going from southern Maine all the way down to the Gulf states and Louisiana. So this is an exceedingly easy plant to recognize because you'll see the leaves have 3 different shapes: no thumbs, 1 thumb, and 2 thumbs, all in the same tree. Only tree that does that. And it has 2 main edible parts. It's the roots and the young leaves. And the roots have that very familiar root beer type flavor. And that's in the bark of the root bark. So you peel the root bark, or you can just chop the roots into bits to fit into the pot. And you can simmer them on a stove in some water and make your sassafras tea that way. I have a recipe in my book for sassafras candy, which is like the root beer barrels you used to buy at the penny candy store, only even better because it's got little bits of root bark embedded in the candies. So it's really good. Okay, having said that, I have to tell you that about 50 years ago, several studies were done that showed that saffrol, which is the essential oil in the sassafras root bark that's responsible for the root beer flavor. So they synthesized the saffrol, and they fed a huge amount of it to rats, and some of those rats got cancer. So the Food and Drug Administration found out about that, and they said, okay, sassafras or saffrol is off the market, that's it. And so that's how it stands today. It's officially banned, all right? But all those studies showed was that if you feed a whole bunch of synthetic saffrol to rats, some of those rats got cancer. I'm not aware of any study that shows a carcinogenic impact on people by eating saffrol. But nevertheless, if you want to say, well, just in case there's something to it, I'm not going to eat the sassafras, I totally support you in that. In fact, I totally support you wherever your comfort level is about all this wild food. If you feel like, okay, well, that looks like the plant, but I'm not sure, and I don't want to poison myself, and you chicken out, you don't eat it, I think it's pretty sensible to do that. So, I'm not here to, make you go beyond where you want to be, all right? I'm just sharing you what I do, and if you decide you want to try it, you can. All right, so anyway, I've had sassafras a bunch of times. It's very tasty, so I'll leave that up to you. Okay, there's another edible part of the plant, and that's the young leaves, and young leaves are used to make filet powders. Have you ever heard of filet powder for filet gumbo? Filet powder is powdered dried sassafras leaves. That's what it is. So you can make it yourself. Just gather the leaves at this stage and dry them and pulverize them, and just put the powder in a little salt and pepper shaker and add it to your food right at the end to flavor and thicken it. And it does not have the saffrol in it. Okay, so lamb's quarters. So this is wild spinach, and you can use it exactly the same as spinach. So this photo is from early June. And the dust that you see in the center of each plant, that's a natural mealiness the plant produces that's not from the road or anything. It's one of the ways to help identify the plant. This is also a really good ingredient in spanakopita, and you don't have to parboil it or anything. Just throw it into the skillet with the eggs and the feta cheese and all the other stuff that's going in for the filling. Cattails are edible. There's a whole chapter in my book on cattails, so I won't spend a lot of time on these. The flower, the bloom spike on a cattail is edible. And so you just boil these until they're tender, and it tastes like a cross between corn and artichokes. Then the cattail hearts are edible. It's a tender part of the developing stem. It's like cucumber hearts of palm. And then cattail pollen is edible. It's hypoallergenic, and you can just wander to the cattail swamp with a bag and take the male flower and give it a shake, and this cloudy yellow pollen comes off, and keep doing that. And you'll have a cup or more of the cattail pollen, which you put through a fine mesh sieve just to get out any twigs or bugs or anything. And then you add the cattail pollen to regular flour to make these beautiful and very highly nutritious cattail baked products like these muffins. All right, so this is the little leaf linden, really common street tree, especially in Boston, like on Cambridge Street near where Mass General is. In June, you can smell the linden trees because when they're blooming. It's a very nice sort of lemony honey smell. So you can make tea from these flowers, and the tea tastes good, and it has 2 medicinal values. It's soothing to your digestive system and to your mental state at the same time. It's very well known medicinal tea in Europe for that reason. So this is actually the European species, but we have a native American species too, the Tilia americana, otherwise known as basswood, and you can use it the exact same way. All right, so this is Juneberry, Amelanchier, and the best time to look for these is when the plant is blooming, because the white flowers, you can see it at a distance, because when the fruit is ripe in June, it has this purpley color and it's hard to see at a distance. So it's good to actually know where these are beforehand, and then you know where to go and look for the fruit later. So now these do grow in the wild. I do occasionally see them there, but they're also pretty common in parks and landscaped areas because landscapers use them. It's one of the native species they like to use in landscaping because it blooms early before the crab apples do, and it has this fruit which is small, and the birds eat it, so it doesn't really create a mess because there's not like piles of rotting fruit underneath the tree afterwards. But the typical Juneberry tree is 12 feet tall, and the songbirds can be working the upper branches, and you could be stuffing your face in the lower branches, and there's plenty of fruit to go around. You can all have a great time. So this fruit, although it looks like blueberries, it actually tastes like a mixture of cherries and almonds. So it's very good, and it's good raw, and mulberries are ripe at the same time. And so I like to mix Juneberries and mulberries together and make strudel. All right. So this is a plant called Juneberry. This is an annual species that seeds prolifically, and you'll often see in the same spot, usually a somewhat sunny spot where it's damp is where you're going to see it. And this plant, I'll talk about the medicinal use first. This plant has been clinically proven to cure poison ivy for some people. And you just take the entire plant and scrunch it up and get the juice out of it. It's a juicy, succulent plant. And then put that juice in the place where you either have poison ivy or where you think are exposed to poison ivy. And if you want that remedy available year-round, what you can do is gather up that plant, bring it home, throw it in a pot, boil it up, and then take that liquid and pour it into ice cube trays and freeze it. And then you can just take an ice cube and put that on your skin. I'm about to tell you. Okay. So see this little guy right there? That is the seed pod, and inside that seed pod are the seeds, and the seeds are the edible part of this plant. But the tricky part is when these seed pods are ripe, they detonate, they explode at the slightest touch. So that's why it's called touch me not, because if you brush against the plant when the seed pods are ripe, they just go, they shoot all over the place. So if you want to eat those seeds, what you need to do is sneak up on one of those seed pods and grab it and have it explode in your hand. It won't hurt. So that's what a ripe seed pod looks like, and you give it a gentle squeeze and it just blows apart like that. And then letter D, the football-shaped things, those are the ripe seeds, and if you eat them, they taste just like walnuts, and not like black walnuts, like store-bought English walnuts, all right? And the other cool thing you can do with those seeds, if you take one of those ripe seeds and you gently rub the outer covering off, the inner color is this beautiful, bright robin's egg blue color. And I have no idea why that color is in there, because no creatures ever see it. It's just one of those mysteries of Mother Nature. All right, purslane is a really common farm and garden weed in the summer once the hot weather shows up. It's a very nutritious plant. It's one of the highest sources of omega-3 fatty acids we know of. And you can eat it raw, you can eat it cooked. And this is, I'm going to show you a way to use this plant that requires no cooking skill whatsoever. Is you can throw the purslane leaves in a gazpacho. And you don't even have to make the gazpacho. You can go to the store and buy the gazpacho and then just throw the purslane leaves in there. And the texture of the purslane leaves works really well in a gazpacho. All right, so here's black raspberry, and I don't need I don't need to tell you how to use the fruit. I'm sure you can figure that out on your own. I will tell you, though, the time to look for black raspberries is now, or actually maybe even a little earlier, when the snow is out, because these purpley colors on the canes, it shows up really well, even in the middle of the winter. So you could be out walking your dog, cross-country skiing, whatever, and see those purpley thorny canes and say, black raspberries. I got to remember this spot and check it in late June, early July, and look for the fruit. All right, black cherries are edible, and the cherries will vary in flavor from tree to tree. So sometimes they can be really puckery and astringent, and other times they can be sweet, just about as good as a regular cherry, but they're small. There's no getting around that. Each individual cherry will approach but not quite get to ½ inch in diameter, and the pits inside each fruit aren't that much smaller than conventional cherry pits. So I wouldn't recommend trying to use black cherries for any recipe that required pitting each individual fruit, because that would be exceedingly tiresome. So I usually just eat them right off the tree, but if you wanted to make something from them, you pick off the cherries and bring them home and throw them in a pot with some water and simmer them for a while, and then put everything through a food mill or a sieve, and then the pits will be held back and the pulp and the juice will go through. All right, so this is the common elderberry plant, and this is relatively common in this area. You could be driving, like, heading up from Route 2 towards Route 3 on 128, and look on either side of the road, especially on the east side, the Lexington side, and just see them blooming in the swamplands there. It's not exactly, you're not going to pull over in the breakdown lane and hop out of your car and pick them, but at least you'll be able to see them there. When you see them there, you can look for them somewhere else where you might be able to pick them. But I just need to get on my soapbox for just a second and talk to you about a little thing I'm worried about, and that is the commodification and the monetization of wild plants as foraging gets kind of trendy and restaurants are starting to get into it and stuff like that. And so let me tell you a quick story. So several years ago, I get an email from a produce store that I won't mention it, but it's pretty well known in Cambridge, and they wrote me to ask me, tell us where the elderberry plants are so we can pick the flowers and make this syrup we could sell at our store. I wouldn't tell them. I told them the kind of habitat the plants like to grow in, but I didn't want to tell them about a specific spot because I was too afraid they'd just go hammer it. So here is a scenario. I don't know if this has actually happened, but I think it's pretty plausible. Let's take some chef really fixated on an elderflower, wants to put on the menu, says to somebody, hey, go out there, pick me 10 pounds of elderflower. So this poor schnook is running around, trying to find this plant, and finally finds a bush like this with the blossoms on there, and he looks at that bush and he says, if I pick every flower off this bush, I can fill this order. And I don't have time to run around and find other plants. I can get back to the restaurant. So there go all the flowers, which means no flowers left for any pollinators. No fruit is going to form on the plant because you have to leave the flowers on the plant to get the fruit. So that's the impact I'm worried about. So I said to this produce store, I said, there's some lovely and delicious edible invasive species out there, like the black locust is really delicious flower. If you're going to commercialize wild plants, can I suggest that you move in that direction? Because the chances of you upsetting the ecological balance, or if all the, restaurants are real monkey see, monkey do. If somebody's selling something well, then this other restaurant wants to carry it, and the cumulative impact of all the restaurants moving heavily into elderflower, could devastate our wild plants out there. So I said, how about these invasive species? And they said, no, we want elderflower. And so my response to them was, well, then I suggest you get a farmer to grow it for you. Because, as you know, farmers often have wetlands next to the cultivated fields where they can't be growing the normal row crops, but they could put a row of elderberry plants in. And if those flowers are picked and sold to the restaurants, at least they're not harming the wild populations. All right, so anyway, so here's a couple products made from elderflower, and the one on the left is from New Zealand where elder plants aren't native, so I can't really complain about that one. And the one on the right, the Saint Germain liqueur, I assume that they're gathering their flowers sustainably, otherwise they'd pick themselves right out of business. But anyway, remember in the beginning of the talk I was talking about how you have to use forbearance and restraint when you're picking native species just to make sure you don't upset the ecological balance. I just want to underscore that point a little bit with this particular species, the elderberry, because of this critter. This is the elderberry borer beetle. This really cool beetle spends most of its life associated with elderberry plants. So the adults are mating on the mature elderberry plant, laying the eggs there, and then the larvae live inside the elderberry plants. They're not harming the plants. The plant and the beetle have co-evolved for millennia, so there's no problems there. So if this plant got really hot commercially and, everybody was picking it to sell it, that doesn't kill the beetle directly, but if we prevented the plant from reproducing in the wild, began to lose them in the wild, this beetle would lose its habitat. So that's the point I'm making. So I don't want to, come on too strong and scare you from picking wild plants. That's the whole point of this talk, is to have you connect to the landscape through your taste buds, including the elderberry. It's just, let me put it this way. When I first became aware about 10 years ago, this stuff was being commercialized, I thought, what the hell have I been doing? I'm giving these lectures, telling people about them. Am I a cause of this problem? Should I shut the hell up? And then I eventually rationalized this, and I said, well, if I stop teaching and I'm just going to yield the field to the people, say, cash in on the wild foods craze. If I continue to talk and I try to sell the conservation message like I did tonight, how important that is, I feel like it's better than if I just yield the field to the people that think of plants as an article of commerce. So anyway, at least that's my rationalization. All right, so if you leave the elder flowers on the plant, you get these elder berries. So that photo isn't upside down. That's what the berry clusters do when they're ripe. And elderberries aren't good to eat straight off the plant. You have to dry them first or cook them first to make them safe to eat, but after that they're fine. And I like to mix them with apples to make elderberry sauce, elderberry pie, elderberry apple pie, elderberry applesauce. All right, spice bush berries are savory flavored, so you use them like a black or a Szechuan pepper. But they're important food for migrating songbirds, so if you're going to harvest any of these, make sure you leave lots on the bushes so the birds get all they need. And another reason you might want to plant spice bush in your yard is because it's a host plant for this cool-looking caterpillar, the spice bush swallowtail caterpillar. And by the way, these things right here, those are fake eyes. The caterpillar is trying to imitate a snake to scare away any birds from eating it. Okay, wintergreen, so this grows in this area, and the whole plant, above ground part of the plant has that wintergreen tea berry flavor. And you can make tea from the leaves, but I tend to just use black birch instead, or yellow birch. And you make it from peeling the twigs, and then you put the twigs and the twig peelings in a jar like that. You just let it sit around for an hour, and that's how you get a nice, strong, flavored, wintergreen flavored tea. And you can tap any birch tree, and actually this would be the time to do it right now, because some of the maples, it's already too late. They've already started to flower because of how weirdly warm it was last week. It's already brought an end to the sugaring season around here anyway. So, but the birch trees start flowing a couple weeks after the maple stops, so it's not too late for the birches. And so in Weston, where I grew up, I tapped some birch trees, and I was getting a gallon of sap in an hour. So they really gush. But unfortunately, that sap is even water than the maple sap, and you have to boil the heck out of it to get anything. And what you eventually get looks like that. It looks and tastes just like molasses, which is great. But molasses is so cheap and so easy to get at the stores. My advice would be just go buy molasses. You're not going to save any time or money making your own molasses from birch sap. Having said that, and this is a bit of a survival angle right now, so this is probably one of the few things tonight I'm actually telling you that might be useful to you in a survival situation. If you needed to survive when the birch sap was flowing, which is like a 2-week period in April, okay? So let's hope when, the poop hits the fan, it's then, because if you're in a place where you're concerned about the potability of the water supply, you can tap all the birch trees you need. And by the way, it isn't just black or yellow birch, it's any birch tree. So white birch, gray birch, any birch that's big enough to tap. In April, will have sap flowing through it, and you'll get all the pure, clean drinking water you need that way. Okay? All right, and all right, I better keep going. All right, so mushrooms, we're finally getting into mushrooms. So this is mid to late summer is the main mushroom season. And so this mushroom here is way at the safe end of the line. This one has no poisonous lookalikes. It has an edible lookalike that I'll tell you in just a second. So this is called, some people call it chicken mushroom, chicken of the woods, because if you cut into it, the inside flesh in the mushroom just looks like the breast meat of a chicken. All right? It has very similar texture to chicken too. So, so you'll see that it comes in the top part is pumpkin orange color. The underside is sulfur yellow, chemistry class sulfur yellow. And you see it grows in layers and shelves directly on wood, often a stump or a log, but sometimes a dead tree or a living tree can grow in that too. And you see in the underside of the cap, it doesn't have gills. Gills are the things that radiate out like the spokes of a wheel underneath the cap of a standard store-bought mushroom. So no gills on this one. It's just pores. The spores are dropping out of pores. So this is an edible mushroom, and it's very similar to chicken. You can treat it like chicken. So my wife and I have made like sulfur-shelf fajitas, sulfur-shelf paprikash, sulfur-shelf tetrazzini, and it comes out great all those ways. All right, and here's the look-alike, and this is a pink and white form of the sulfur shelf. It's actually a different species, but it's at least as good as the sulfur shelf. Okay, so the French call this one trompette de mort, which means trumpets of death, but it's only because it's black. It's actually a totally safe mushroom with no poisonous lookalikes, the black trumpet chanterelle. And this one I have seen within 10 miles of here. And the tricky part about this mushroom is it's diminutive. It's only about 2 or 3 inches tall, and it's black, so it's hard to see the first one. Once you see the first one, though, stop in your tracks and look around, and you'll often see dozens, sometimes hundreds of these mushrooms where you're seeing it. And I tend to see it in hardwood forests where there's beech trees. We have a little depression like a former vernal pool or something like that. There's a little bit of a water collection going on. Here's the yellow chanterelle. So these are trickier to recognize than the black chanterelle. These do have poisonous lookalikes, so this is a little bit more challenging. And so there's the yellow chanterelles in the center. And then this mushroom on the outside is called the lobster mushroom because of the cooked lobster color. It's actually a fungus growing on a fungus. The mushroom, a white mushroom, a lactarius mushroom, starts growing, and then it's colonized by this lobster color mold that grows on it and converts an inedible mushroom into an edible mushroom. All right, here's the grayling mushroom, and the only place this mushroom grows is in the hair-cap moss. And it's got a little umbo, or a little point in the center of this one. Now this one also has poisonous lookalikes too, but once you know it, you'll know it, and then you'll be safe. This one has no poisonous lookalikes. This is the sweet-tooth mushroom, or the hedgehog, and it has little teeth. So if you could see, I apologize for those of you in the back that can't see this, but it's got teeth on the underside of the cap hanging down like the roof of a cave. All right? And there are no poisonous tooth mushrooms. There are a few that are bitter, don't taste good, but there aren't any that would make you sick. And that one I see under hemlocks. Okay, so the only lookalike to the mushroom in that photo is a volleyball. So that is a giant puffball mushroom, and that's not even a particularly big one. They get to be more than twice that big. And this photo was taken up in Maine, but I have seen these in Massachusetts. And the standard way to cook these is, by the way, you want to test it, and when you cut into it, you want it to be nice and white and firm. You don't want it to be soft. You don't want it to be yellow or green or any other color. If it's white and firm and it's this big and it's not a volleyball, it's going to be edible. And anyway, so standard way to cook this mushroom is just slice it to 1/2-inch thick steaks, roll it into a beaten egg, and then some seasoned breadcrumbs or cracker crumbs, and just fry it in a skillet in a little butter, make country fried puffball steaks. And this one mushroom could easily feed everybody in this photo. Okay, so this is the Boletus edulis, or the porcini mushroom. This is an eboli group of mushrooms. It's a relatively safe group. There are no deadly poisonous species of boletes that I'm aware of that grow around here. There are a couple that would give you a stomach ache, but none that are seriously poisonous. So this is a group of family that some beginning mushroom hunters will go for this kind because it's less risk of getting into trouble. So what you want to look for is the cap on the Boletus edulis is the same color as a loaf of baked bread. And then when the pores, the spongy layer on the underside of the cap is mature, it's this olive yellow color. When it's young, it's this white color. But the key distinguishing feature on the top of the stalk right here, it's this net-like markings called a reticulation that's white, and it looks like somebody took some fine mesh or gauze and wrapped the top of the stalk with it. And that's distinctive to the Boletus edulis mushroom. And these mushrooms dry very well, so if you find more that you can eat right away, you can dry them and eat them for years later. They won't go bad. All right, here's a really cool mushroom, one of my favorite mushrooms, called a beefsteak mushroom. And this one looks literally like a piece of meat growing on a tree. And you cut into it. It's got marbling just like a piece of meat. You squeeze it. It has red juice like a piece of meat. So my favorite way to eat this one is brush it with a little teriyaki sauce and grill it on a hibachi like a piece of meat. All right, so this is a cauliflower mushroom. This photo was taken out in Marlborough, Mass, long time ago. And then this photo is a much more recent version. That's my wife just a couple years ago. Same species of mushroom there. It looks like a big mass of yellow egg noodles. And you see them at the base of pine trees around Labor Day. And there's no lookalikes to this one. And it tastes like mushroomy egg noodles. It's really good. All right, so this is the bear's head tooth. This one looks like a frozen waterfall hanging on usually a beech tree, often at eye level, and the texture of this one is really similar to crab meat. So it's very good. All right, this is probably the most bizarre organism in the show. This is the corn smut. This is a fungus that gets into the ears of corn and swells up the little kernels and stuff. I'll give you a close-up of it. So I have to admit, it is not the most appetizing thing I've ever seen and thought about eating, but you see, I'm very excited about finding it here because I had heard that this is a delicacy in Mexico, that they sell it in farmers markets and stuff like that. And I heard that during the days of the Aztecs, that if you were a peasant and you found this growing on your corn, you weren't even allowed to touch it. You'd have to send for the emissary, the emperor, and they would collect it and take it off to the royal courts, and only the royalty could eat it. And I thought, all right, it must be good then. So I cooked it up like you'd cook up any mushroom, a little butter, a little oil, and I took a bite out of it. And it tasted like mud. And I thought, what is the big deal about this mushroom? So I thought, all right, I'm going to try it one more time. And I cooked it in a Mexican style with the poblano chiles, and there's some kind of chemical transformation that happens with the capsaicin, the hot substance in the hot peppers that makes the corn smut taste good. So that's my advice if you're going to cook it. All right, so here's the head of the woods mushroom. This one definitely grows in Burlington, and you want to look at it at the base of large black or red oak trees. And the larger and older the tree is, the more likely you are to find these. And sometimes you can find more than one. And they can be this big, but so, you know, there's a whole bunch. My wife and I had help finding all these, but 2 people could find that many on their own in one place when they're really cranking. But I actually like them at the chick stage when they're just forming, because I find them to be much milder, more tender at that stage. All right, so now I just have about 10 more minutes worth of plants, and then we'll be done. I could take questions, and then you can go eat some food in the back, and we can talk about the nuts. I can sign some books and stuff. All right, so here's the sumac plant. There's a chapter on sumac in my book. If you've been worried about this sumac, that this might be poison sumac, you've been worrying needlessly, because poison sumac has drooping clusters of greenish-white berries. Any red-berried sumac is not only not poison sumac, it's an edible sumac. This is staghorn sumac. And so the main edible part are these ripe berry clusters. So you pick them off the plant, and they have a very tart flavor. And what I do is I make a drink from them, and this explains how I do it. It's all explained in my book, but basically you're just kneading them in water, warm or cold water, for a few minutes, and then straining it, and then you get the sumacade, which is very lovely and delicious. All right, wild grapes, these definitely grow in Burlington, and you often smell these vines before you see them. And you just follow your nose to the vines and then stuff your face with the grapes. It's really good. And very common in my car to have baskets like this in there in September when these are ripe. And grape cheesecake is one fun way to use them. Yes, ma'am.
I have those all in my backyard. Is there there's no poisonous lookalikes to that? I was never sure if they're
Yes.
edible or not. Oh, there is?
No, they're not around here. No, there's no poisonous lookalikes around here.
Yeah, they grow
Right.
all up through the trees
Right.
in the backyard, and we never were sure.
Don't they smell like grapes?
They do.
Yeah, they're grapes.
They look so round and perfect. I wasn't
Yeah,
sure if they
those are wild grapes. That's this species right there, the fox grape. You're a very lucky person to have
Let us
those.
know when you try them.
Yeah. You know, taste one, and it should have that really familiar, this is definitely a grape taste. If it doesn't, it might be something else. But I really can't think of what else it could be. All right, so this is the riverside grape, another species that grows around here. And these have the more tender leaves. The people that like to make the stuffed grape leaves like this species because the leaves are more tender. So there they are. Hazelnuts, these grow in Burlington. I tend to find these under power lines, and the time I look for hazelnuts are September 8th. I have that date marked in my calendar. And that's when the hazelnuts are still on the bushes and they haven't fallen off. You do not want to wait until they fall off the bushes because you will never find them. The squirrels and chipmunks will get them all. So pick them slightly underripe off the bushes, spread them out in a newspaper in your garage for a couple weeks, wait until they ripen completely, and then eat them. And you see they're just like miniature versions of store-bought hazelnuts. And they have the same flavor. Acorns are edible. I've given you a handout about eating acorns in the back, so I don't need to cover those anymore. Shagbark hickory, this is my #1 favorite edible plant out of everything I've talked about in the show and everything I haven't talked about in the show. So, and I have collected these in Burlington, so you have them, so which is really great. And so there's a basket, of the nuts I'm picking, and that's, the outside part is this green or greenish yellow, and then there's the nut inside. You crack them open to get the nut meats. And here's a maple hickory nut pie, the New England version of pecan pie, my recipe. It's in my book, and virtually everybody I feed this to prefer it over pecan pie. Here's 3 different cookies I make from hickory nuts. So you didn't get any of these because I made you something from a different species. That's the barberry I make the jelly from, and that cookie that had jelly in it. So I made you something from these. These are black walnuts. And I'm going to, I told some people earlier where to pick black walnuts, but I'll tell all of you, it's a place right near here. It's Willard's Woods in Lexington off North Street or North Road, just south of the Burlington line. And the park is filled with black walnuts, and it's actually okay according to town law. I checked to gather the black walnuts there, and I'm happy to tell you about that spot because there's enough for us to share. And there's plenty for the squirrels too. So anyway. So that you don't have to pick them off the tree. Wait till they hit the ground, and then they'll look like that. And you need to get this green part off, and the handout I've got for you in the back explains how to do that. And then once you get the green part off, it looks like that. And then here's a couple things you could do. So I gave you the recipe for this one. That's in the handout, and I made this one for you tonight, the black walnut honey squares. So those are in the back. You get to try them if you haven't already in just a minute or two. So here's groundnut, a native species, and the edible part is not a nut, it's a tuber, and that's what it looks like. And you slice those up thinly, and you get the fried groundnut chips. Jerusalem artichoke, the main edible part is the tuber. And last week when it was really warm and the ground wasn't frozen, you could have dug them up because it's an off-season foraging opportunity. So it's like, from mid to late fall into the beginning of the next spring is when to look for these tubers. Okay, so finally, here's the autumn olive. So this is what it looks like in the spring. There's a close-up of the flowers. It has a very nice smell. There's that fruit I showed you before. And there's a close-up of the fruit. It has these silvery white speckles on it. So I pick this off the bushes, and I just throw it in a pot like a lobster pot with just enough water in the bottom to keep the fruit from scorching, like a half of an inch. I simmer it for a while to soften it up, and then I put everything through a food mill to separate the seeds from the pulp, but you could just use a strainer or a sieve and do that. And then you take that frothy mauve-colored puree, and I pour it into trays in a food dehydrator, and I let it dry overnight. And the next day, what I have is what you ate. That's it. I don't add sugar or lemon juice or anything. That's 100% pure autumn olive fruit pulp. So there it is on the left, right there. So besides tasting good, the USDA did a study in the autumn olive fruit pulp a few years back, and they discovered that it's up to 18 times higher in lycopene content than tomatoes. All right, so anyway. Okay, finally, here is the last slide in the show. This documents a very successful foraging day I had in Worcester County about a decade ago. So let me just go through what's in the photo here. So we've got some wild pears down here, some shagbark hickory nuts over here, a big basket of autumn olives. These are all porcini mushrooms that I taught you. I didn't teach you this one, but this is the Agaricus arvensis, or the horse mushroom. It's a large cousin of the standard store-bought mushroom. You're probably wondering what the barbecue grill is doing in the photo. Well, somebody had put one of those out with their trash, and I needed one of those at home, so I just foraged for that while I was foraging for everything else. So thank you. That's the show. All right, so I'm happy to take questions. There's my contact info if you want it. And this book that we mentioned, I'll just pull up one here. So this is a book that a land trust published. This is the Essex County Greenbelt Association. This is for Northeast Mass, that corner of the state. And this land trust allows foraging as a permitted activity in all their properties that are open to the public, which is dozens of properties covering hundreds of acres. And I'm so grateful for that. I just said, keep all the money the book makes and just buy more land with it, create more foraging opportunities. So if you buy a book from me tonight, it's $15. They get all the money. All right, I'm happy to sign it for you. All right, so you have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
How do we find information about your wall?
Oh, that's in the handouts that you have. So if you just type that link into your computer, you'll get there and find it. All right. Yes, ma'am.
Who's studying with chaga?
Chaga, yes. Yeah.
One of my kids is really into
Yeah, so chaga, it's a mushroom that you see mostly on birch trees, occasionally some other kinds, and it's black and it's weird looking, and it's valued mostly medicinally. Some people enjoy the flavor of the tea, and it's a bit trendy now, and because of that, people are hacking it off the trees and selling it, and I've heard the alarm raised on some quarters about that they think it's getting depleted. And, it has some important ecological role in the ecosystem, probably, that we don't fully understand. So it's once again, when something gets hot and becomes an article of commerce, that it can trigger some unscrupulous behavior. People gathering a little bit for themselves, I don't have an objection to that. I mean, that's what this whole talk is about. It's just when people are, converting stuff to cash, sometimes the scruples fall by the wayside. So, anyway.
What about the Japanese knotweed root?
Japanese knotweed root. Okay. So I'll tell you this quick story, and then what I'll do, I think, is we'll move to the back. I'll bring my books over there so you can be eating stuff, and you don't have to be up here. All right. So how many of you remember the 60 Minutes TV show that aired, I don't know, like 30 years ago when they were studying the French paradox? They're trying to figure out, why are the French dying of heart attacks with all the foie gras and croissants and all this heavy, fatty food they're eating all the time? And they thought, well, maybe it's the red wine that they drink with their meals. And then they thought, well, maybe it's this chemical called resveratrol that's in grape skins that might be responsible for it. So then they started studying resveratrol, and there's some debate about exactly what it's good for. But some studies are showing that it not only raises your good cholesterol, but it also appears to cure cancer, cure Lyme disease, and make you live longer. And so as the news is getting out about resveratrol, the pills are flying off the shelves. There's a $30 million business in resveratrol pills in the United States, and almost all those pills are imported from China. And the commercial source of resveratrol that gets into those pills, it's extracted from the roots of Japanese knotweed. And it's made in China. When this plant is ubiquitous all around here, we could have, Burlington Public Library brand resveratrol pills, and think of all the great programming that they could support here in the library, with all that money. So anyway, so that's the...
Plus it's invasive, so
right.
If you kill it, that's good.
Right.
That's the kind of processing that has to happen.
Right, and so, so when I give a talk like this, I hope that there's a pharmacologist in the audience would say, I know how to do that, and we'll just make it happen. But in the meantime, I've been told that you get resveratrol just from eating the plant. And actually, in my show, the mulberry fruit has resveratrol in it. The grape leaves in my show have resveratrol in it. So there's other ways to get it, in a culinary way.